So once again, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for the final Landlord Outreach Learning Community of the year, where we're going to be talking about hope streams and aspirations and overall rehabilitation goal setting. My name is Emily Bands. I'm here with my colleague Earl Leach, and we're going to be facilitating today. So I do want to acknowledge that today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is going to be an interactive webinar, and we encourage you to participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent by email after the presentation. Earl, if you could please put the slides in the chat box. I do have a copy of the slides for you if you'd like to see them now, but they will be sent out in addition with the recording after today's webinar. I also want to go back to that piece where I said today is going to be interactive. It is going to be interactive, so I do hope that everybody's ready to participate and chat with us in the chat box. I do try to make any webinars that I facilitate to be I try to make webinars to be engaging, is what I'm trying to say. So I will be asking questions. I do like to engage in conversation and dialogue, and I think that that's the way that this format has worked well in the past when I've facilitated landlord outreach calls. So please be ready to participate. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll chat and we'll have a good webinar. So just some housekeeping. So again, this is recording. I am recording at the moment. A copy of the recording in PowerPoint is going to be sent out. In terms of audio and video, please connect to audio. You are already muted. You can call in if you need to, and everybody's video is turned off. To participate, please feel free to use the chat box. I did enable that setting so everybody can chat in the chat box to each other. And you can also ask to be unmuted if you would like to speak. And if you would like to, I guess, verbally say something, I'm happy to unmute you. If you are unmuted, just please be mindful that will allow for your video to be shown. And if your video is shown and you do choose to turn your video on, please make sure that your video is appropriate, the background's appropriate, and that your dress is appropriate. But you also don't have to show your video if you do choose to be unmuted. If you would like to be unmuted, please say so in the chat box or just raise your hand and I can unmute you. And then be ready to participate. As I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, and I'll say a little bit more about it. The best way for us to learn is really together. I will give you a little bit of background on myself, but at the end of the day, everybody has their own knowledge and perspective and experience. And I think that's what makes these calls work really well, is when everybody lends that knowledge and perspective to each other. So please be ready to participate. So my name is Emily Bands. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in New Jersey. I'm also a lecturer in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions here at Rutgers School of Health Professions. I've been working for this department since the spring of 2019. Our primary function in our department, myself and my colleague Earl, who is on the call today, is to provide training and technical assistance to supportive housing providers licensed by our state mental health authority, the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So we provide training and technical assistance to supportive housing providers in New Jersey, similar to in similar roles as to what you all do out in Washington State. Prior to working in this department, though, I actually worked in supportive housing. I started working as a direct care staff, and then I ended up becoming a supervisor before I shifted over into this role. So I do have experience providing supportive housing services, as well as experience with facilitating these trainings. I've been a facilitator for various landlord outreach call trainings since I started in 2019. And in addition to that, Earl and I facilitate the Golden Thread of Documentation training for foundational community supports. So some of you may know me and Earl from there. So let's get to it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of overall rehabilitation goals. So I'm going to describe what overall rehabilitation goals are and how overall rehabilitation goals are a little bit different than the goals that you might see or might develop on a person's ISP or their service plan. We're also going to talk a little bit about some barriers to setting overall rehabilitation goals. I think in general, people find there to be challenges with setting goals in general, right? It can be kind of hard to have that conversation and reflect to be able to determine what you want to work on in the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about barriers, and then we're going to talk about the goals, values, and principles of psychiatric rehabilitation and how they can inform overall rehabilitation goal setting. I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with the goals, values, and principles of psych rehab. I'm going to ask that question in a little bit. But we're going to link this concept of overall rehabilitation goals back to the goals, values, and principles of psych rehab. Because I think it can be challenging to develop overall rehabilitation goals, but thinking about the goals, values, and principles of psych rehab can help you as a practitioner, as well as the consumer that you're working with, to figure out what types of goals they want to work on. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions? Okay. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Again, I want this to be very conversational, so don't feel like you have to, that I need to ask if anybody has questions to ask a question. Feel free to just ask a question and I'm happy to address it, okay? So I want to start out by just kind of giving an overview of what goals, values, and guiding principles actually are. So when we think of goals, we're thinking about these desired states or objectives that we're striving for and trying to achieve. Okay, so goals are basically the point at which we want to be, right? Goals are really thinking about what kind of person we want to be, what we want to be doing, where we want to be living, who we want to be spending time with at whatever point in time we're thinking of in the future. Okay, and a goal is something that we're actively working toward to try to get to. Values are the beliefs and attitudes that influence our behavior. Okay, so the values are going to support or not support our desire to achieve that goal. Okay, and I say support or not support because, again, values are beliefs and attitudes. So if we have the belief that the goal is achievable for us, then it's going to support our ability to work toward that goal and potentially achieve it. However, if we don't have the belief that we're able to achieve that goal, and that could be, a realistic belief, it could be because maybe we don't have the resource or skills in order to achieve that goal, or it could be because maybe this is just what we're thinking. Maybe we're having some negative thoughts about ourselves, so we don't believe we can actually achieve that goal. That's going to negatively impact our ability to achieve that goal, okay? And that's going to impact our behavior, right? If we believe we can't do it, we might not want to work on it, and then we're not working toward that goal. In addition to that, we have our attitudes, right? And our attitudes are how we're viewing that goal, right? If, again, and I think our beliefs and attitudes really connect with each other in a lot of different ways, because if we have an attitude that this isn't going to work or I'm not going to be able to get there, then our behavior is going to be influenced and we might not want to work toward that goal. Along with values, we also have like this motivation piece, right? Whether or not we're motivated to work toward that goal. And then finally, we have our principles. And principles are guidelines that are consistent with our values and help us focus on the overall goals and the day-to-day provision of the wellness and recovery approach. So when we're thinking about principles, we're thinking about the almost like rules or standards that we live by. I'll say standards. I think standards is a better word. But we're thinking about the standards that we're living by that are influencing how we go about working toward achieving our goals, or as a practitioner, how you go about providing the services that you provide. Okay. Because again, these goals, values, and principles can very much apply in the context of working with somebody toward a goal and looking at how values and principles that the person has influences their ability to work toward that goal. But it can also be looked at as a staff person, right? If your goal as a staff person is to help the individuals you're working with to achieve the goal, or if it's to just be a good worker, right? There are going to be values and principles that are going to influence that. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about goals, values, and principles before I move forward? Okay. If you do, just put it in the chat. So before I get into goals, I want to go to values and principles, right? Because values and principles are what is going to help us to achieve that goal, right? So in psychiatric rehabilitation, we have 6 values. The first value is self-determination and empowerment. And that is supporting the individual that you're working with to make their own choices and giving them the opportunity and ability to make their own choices and empowering them to do so, supporting their ability to make their own choices. We also look at the optimism that everyone has the capacity to recover, learn, and grow, right? So in general, as a practitioner, we believe that everybody, regardless of the symptoms that they're experiencing, regardless of what situation they're in, they have the ability to recover. They have the ability to learn and increase their knowledge, engage in activities in the community in order to learn, as well as grow as a human being. We also value cultural diversity and also understand the impact of cultural diversity on how we are going to potentially provide services to people. Okay, so when we as practitioners have to acknowledge the differences that we have in our culture versus the culture that we're working with, of the person that we're working with, and making sure that we're in alignment and having some understanding of what that person's culture is, so we can provide culturally sensitive services. We also value the dignity and worth of every individual. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're providing services in a respectful manner. And I think this value is very much in alignment with self-determination and empowerment, right? Because we're encouraging people to have the dignity to make their own choices and make their own mistakes. And I think that is very much something that supports an individual's worth, because we're showing them that they can make choices, that they are an empowered individual, and that they can, and they have the ability to make these choices. We also focus on wellness, right? So looking at the 8 dimensions of wellness potentially, or just looking at ideally the 8 dimensions of wellness, right? We want to focus on all of those wellness areas, but also thinking about physical wellness, thinking about their mental health and wellness, and making sure that services are, if the person chooses, focused in those areas. And then finally, we have this promotion of valued social roles and normalized environments, right? So making sure that the person is receiving services, maybe in the community, maybe in terms of looking at housing, looking at a housing setting where any person in the community might be able to live there. So these are the values of psych rehab. And I'm going to ask everybody a question now. Even if you don't know or didn't, well, let me ask you, I'm going to ask a couple questions. So first and foremost, was anybody familiar with the values of psychiatric rehabilitation, or is this new information for everybody? If it's new information, say yes. If it's not new information, say no. All right, getting a lot of yeses. My question for you, though, is in thinking of your values as a worker, are any of your values as a worker aligned with what these 6 values of psych rehab are? And you can just say, yeah. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of yeses. Absolutely, yes. Right. And I always like to point that out, because I think when we, oh, did you mean to raise your hand? If you didn't mean to raise your hand, that's okay. Okay. So I'd like to ask that question because I think when we start talking about psychiatric rehabilitation, sometimes people are like, well, I don't know what that is, or I'm more familiar with social work, or I'm more familiar with counseling principles, or I'm more familiar with like, general behavioral health and the medical model, or even just the treatment model. People don't necessarily know psychiatric rehabilitation. But what I always find is that people are doing and encompassing these values and principles of psychiatric rehabilitation without knowing that that's actually what it's called. So I always like to point that out because I think we're all on the same page here, right? We're all encompassing these values. So another question I have for you is, how do these values come into play when you're trying to support somebody in working toward a goal? Do you feel like these values come into play at all? And if you don't feel like they do, you can just say no. Okay, can anybody tell me a little bit more about how? How do they come into play? Does anybody have an example? Absolutely, Yolanda, right? It is a guide. It very much is a guide. I'm going to give everybody a minute or so to see if anybody has a specific example. Thank you. I'm going to say non, but maybe it's nan. So let me know if I said that correctly, and which version was maybe correct. And you had put this just to Earl and I, so I am going to share it. But you said, yes, it does come into play because this is what drives them to achieve their goal or dream, etc. Absolutely, right? So that optimism that everyone has the capacity to recover, learn, and grow, right? That's going to be displayed when you're working with the person and they're saying they want to work on a goal. Like, let's say they're saying, I really want to drive a car. And you say, okay, how can I help you to support that? Right? That's how that's kind of displayed. In terms of like cultural diversity, right? When the person says that maybe they want to start attending church, but maybe English is not their primary language, and you're supporting them and trying to help them and link them to a church that is in their first language, right? That's acknowledging that cultural diversity piece. In terms of promotion of valued social roles and normalized environments, right? That could be referring somebody to an employment opportunity that's not like a what are they called? I know we used to have them in New Jersey, but I can't remember that what they're called now. I'm going to go to a different example because I can't remember what they're called. But in terms of social roles and normalized environments, the example I used before in terms of having referring somebody to an apartment building that any person could live at, right? So this is how values of psychiatric rehabilitation can play into this. And Nat, you said, yes, using client choice and holistic approach, these values would align with the work I do as a mental health case manager. Right. So focusing on that client choice, absolutely, right? And looking at this more holistic approach, right? So looking at wellness as a whole, maybe. And I'm happy that you bring up the client choice aspect of this, right? Because if we go back to goal setting, right, goals should really be focused on that client choice. And in that, going back to this value of self-determination and empowerment, we're really focusing on supporting the person where they're at and supporting them in terms of whatever goal it is they want to achieve. So going back to this goal of maybe wanting to drive a car, we're giving them that choice. We're allowing them to make that choice, that that's the goal that they want to work on, and then we're providing that support to them to do so. So thank you guys for that. So now we have these 12 principles of psychiatric rehabilitation. And the 12 principles are using a person-centered approach, which goes back to that idea of client choice, that utilization of peer support, focus on work and career development, integration of treatment and rehabilitation services, partnership between the service provider and service user, utilization of natural support, assessments related to person-chosen goals and environments, ongoing accessible and coordinated services, the partnership with family members and significant others, having strengths focused, and emphasis on goal-related skills training, resource development, and environmental modifications, and then having this empirical orientation. So these are the principles of psych rehab. And I'm going to ask again, though I think I already know the answer. How many of you are already encompassing these principles within your work? And if you are, just say yes. I got a lot more yeses for the values. So is anybody not using these principles in their work? Okay. So in thinking of these principles of psych rehab, I want to ask another open-ended question. So please make sure that you respond in the chat box. But how do the principles of psych rehab potentially inform your process of setting goals with individuals, or how do they influence that goal setting process that you all partake in when working with people? And one example that I could give, and I'm going to ask others to please give examples as well, specific examples, is strengths focus, right? So when we're developing goals with individuals, we're using strengths focused language. I think that's a good example. In terms of maybe another goal, right? If the person is looking to maybe work toward a physical health goal, Maybe instead of relying on staff for support with that goal, maybe they're utilizing more peer support or natural support. So maybe they're using support of their peers, of some of their friends, but maybe they're also using the support of other friends or family members. Does anybody else have examples of how the principles of psych rehab influence that process? Absolutely, Heather. So you said the principles impact what specific interventions or resources used to meet those goals? Absolutely, right? And there's definitely this emphasis for the principles on skills training, on resource development, on environmental modifications. But again, also going back to my example with that utilization of natural support or peer support, if there is a focus on career or work development, there might be interventions then more focused towards employment. So thank you for that, Heather. So I wanted to give this overview of values and principles before we went into the goals, because the feedback that we've gotten here in New Jersey, and I also think out in Washington State, is that the goal development process can be challenging. It can be challenging to help people to develop goals and figure out what they want to work on, because crises happen, emergencies happen, things come up, sometimes things shift. But sometimes you get to a point where the person's like, I don't really know what I want to work on. Has that ever happened with anybody? And if that has happened with you, with any of the individuals you're working with, say yes. But have you ever worked with somebody and they're just like, I don't know what I want to work on? All the time. Yep, absolutely. Right. So when that happens, what do? Right? We definitely want to ask those questions, and we want to try to support the person in kind of processing it and fleshing it out. But it's good to have resources to kind of look back to think about and relate to the individual that you're working with, right? And thinking of these values and principles of psych rehab can help you to do that, right? Going over and kind of reviewing these values and principles and figuring out what services you've provided in the past, what services the person has maybe recently spoke about needing or wanting, and really using all this information to gather more information to eventually get to a goal. And absolutely, Net, right? So the principles are really like that guide. They really are like that toolkit that you would pick from on a daily basis, based on what the person's goals are. Absolutely, right? Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and get into what overall rehabilitation goals are. Okay, and overall rehabilitation goals are a little bit different than the goals that let me start over. The definition of an overall rehabilitation goal might be a little bit different than what you might historically think of as what a goal means. Okay. So overall rehabilitation goals focus on two specific things. They focus on determining the environment of the goal. So where this goal is going to kind of take place. Okay. So we're looking at where they're living, and that could be the house that they're living in, or the apartment. It could also be their community and that living environment. Okay. Where they're learning, right? So is it around going to school? Is it around taking a class? Is it around learning a new language? A hobby can also fall into this area of learning. And then we have socializing, right? So thinking about, is this a goal around the person making new friends? Is it a goal around the person getting to, maybe enriching and enhancing some of the friendships that they have? Maybe it's about enriching and enhancing some of their familial relationships as well. And then working. So is the goal around the person potentially wanting to find a job, find employment, maybe even volunteering? Okay. So this is what overall rehabilitation goals first emphasize. And then it also emphasizes that outcome. So what is the person looking to achieve in this area? So, excuse me, an example of this might be individual, we'll say consumer would like to learn how to knit a sweater in the next 6 months. Okay. Now I know when we're thinking of goals, we're thinking of something a little bit broader than that, but that's kind of a very short-term example, right? They want to learn how to knit a sweater. Or maybe the person is looking to find a job, right? So the person will find a job at, do you guys have Walmart in Washington State? Is that a store you have? Okay. Do you know Canadians don't have Target? I didn't know that there's no Target. You guys have Target, right? Okay, thank goodness. Okay, yeah. So some places don't have Target and Walmart. We very much have Target and Walmart out here in New Jersey. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page, right? So maybe the person is going to get a job at Walmart in the next 6 months, right? So again, we're focusing on that overall goal of the person finding employment, okay? And what the outcome is, right? The intended outcome is they're going to find employment and it's at this specific place, okay? And overall rehabilitation goals are the bigger picture, right? They're thinking about really what those aspirations are for the person, really where they would like to be longer term, okay? And that's not to say that you can't, as a practitioner, focus on some of those smaller goals, but in helping the person to identify what that longer term goal is, you might actually have a few smaller goals in there. And then that will potentially then help you so you're not getting to that point where you're asking the person what you want to work on, and the person saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure. Does that all kind of make sense? Because I want to make sure that I'm being clear with my point. No one said no, so I'm going to assume that I'm being clear. Okay. So these are some of the benefits of achieving overall or identifying overall rehabilitation goals. So again, overall rehabilitation goals really focus on the person's future. And it's going to even be beyond service delivery. Okay, so these could even be goals that the person is looking to achieve beyond how long you're providing services to them. So the time frame could definitely be within the 6 to 24 month period, but it could also be something beyond that 2-year mark. Okay. It's also going to be a source of motivation for treatment, right? So again, they might have to achieve some of these shorter term goals. But those shorter term goals are going to potentially get them to that longer term goal, that overall rehabilitation goal. And then it also helps the consumer and staff stay on the same page. Okay. And I think this is especially important because I think there are times where staff might have a goal in mind or might have an idea of what, clinically speaking, we think might be something good for the person to work on or work toward. But sometimes there's a misalignment with what the person actually sees for themselves and their own recovery. Has that ever happened to anybody where there's been a time where you think that the person needs to work on a goal? Maybe we'll say like a substance use goal around reducing substances, or maybe a goal around finding employment. And that's not what the person is actually thinking they'd like for themselves. Has that ever happened to anybody? Right. Right. So thinking about these overall rehabilitation goals can help you both to get on the same page. Because again, excuse me, you need that goal for that 3-month or 6-month period. I think when we do the golden thread trainings, we've kind of gotten the consensus from people that the plan is, I know your authorization, I think, is up to 6 months. But plans are normally, updated like at the 90-day mark, 6-month mark, et cetera, right? So we know we have those short-term goals, but what is the person looking to achieve for themselves in the future? And if the person hasn't thought about that, if the person hasn't thought about where they see themselves in 2 years from now or 3 years from now, it might be helpful for the person to think about that and reflect on that, because again, that could potentially lead them and you to identifying some of these shorter term goals that they can work on over these 6-month periods or 3-month periods. So the idea around overall rehabilitation goals is to help the person to think about what this longer term goal is, so that you can then support them in identifying some smaller steps it takes to get to that goal. And those are going to be the smaller goals that you're working with them on over that 3 or 6-month period. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you. Okay. But as we know, there are barriers, right? So there are some challenges that can come up when we're going through this process of identifying some of these overall rehabilitation goals. Okay. So in terms of staff barriers, something that has come up, and this is coming from these two resources. Funnily enough, these are two books that have the same exact title, Psychiatric Rehabilitation. So one was written by Bill Anthony and colleagues, and the other one was written by Carlos Pratt and colleagues. And this is kind of what has come up from the both of them. So in terms of staff barriers, right, we're looking at potentially an insufficient assessment of the consumer. Okay. And that could be for a lot of different reasons. In terms of thinking of the assessment, when an assessment is done, especially initially, you're just getting to know the person and they're just getting to know you, right? And sometimes people just don't feel comfortable disclosing every single little detail about themselves. So as a staff, you might have an idea of what the person wants and what they want to work on and what their history is and how that impacts the goal setting process. And 6, to 12 months from now, that could completely change as new information comes into play because the person is starting to feel comfortable. Okay. It could also be because of staff turnover. And I know that staff turnover and staffing is a really, really big issue here in New Jersey. Is that something that Washington State is experiencing as well? Are you all very short staffed at your agencies? Yeah, right. Absolutely, right? So, Heather, I definitely think that the providers in New Jersey would echo that. We were just on a meeting this morning with providers in New Jersey, and that sentiment was definitely echoed by them. So yeah, so think about it, right? If you're having staffing issues, people have to be seen, right? You have to make sure that the people who need to be seen every day or 3 times a week are being seen every day or 3 times a week. And that means that maybe other people, because they don't need as much time, are not being seen as much. But when you have to meet with the person to do that assessment with them, it also might mean that there's not enough time to really get into the meat and bones about what is happening with the person and what has happened in the past with the person. Okay. The other piece of that is the belief that individuals cannot choose or achieve a goal. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a factor that is happening with any of you here on this call. I don't really get that impression. But that has something that has been identified in research. And although you all, I don't think I'm getting that impression from all of you, that doesn't necessarily mean that, somebody at your agency might not necessarily have that belief. And that is going to impact that documentation. So if it's being documented that, the person, doesn't want to work on their goals, or the person isn't engaged in services, you're going to go out and meet with them now for the first time and have that impression of them. And that's going to influence the types of services you provide to that person, right? So even if you go out there and you get a different impression of that person, right, that is still going to have an influence. So that's also something to really be mindful of. In addition to the staff barriers, though, there's also some consumer barriers. So for them, there's this lack of hope, right? A lot of the individuals, and I'm sure you all would agree with the statement. If you don't agree with the statement, let me know. But a lot of the individuals we work with, they've experienced trauma. They've had a lot of different, very, very challenging experiences throughout their life. Homelessness is incredibly traumatic for people. Hospitalization, right? Hospitalization can be a barrier if somebody ends up starting to experience symptoms and then they have to go into the hospital. That could be a barrier to goal setting, but hospitalization in and of itself is something that is very traumatic for people. And then an increase in symptoms can also impact this overall rehab goal setting process. Because if the person's experiencing symptoms, that might mean that they, meetings have now shifted to focus on maybe coping skills and focus more on trying to help them to decrease some of those symptoms, or it could potentially lead to hospitalization. Okay. And it's important to be mindful of some of these barriers, because at the end of the day, overall rehabilitation goal setting is something to definitely focus on and something to try to have as a conversation with the individuals that you're working with. But at the same time, we understand that things happen, right? Things happen. There are barriers, there are things that get in the way, but some of these barriers, especially some of the staff barriers, can be overcome. So now I want to shift gears into the goals of psychiatric rehabilitation. And I really want to look at how these goals of psychiatric rehabilitation and how honing in on these goals of psychiatric rehabilitation and using them as sort of a touchstone, how they can directly influence this process of setting these overall rehabilitation goals. Okay. So psychiatric rehabilitation has 3 goals: recovery, quality of life, and community integration. Okay. So when we're thinking of recovery, we're very much thinking of something that is a very individualized process, right? Recovery is very specific to the person who's in recovery. And recovery has different meanings for different disciplines. But in psychiatric rehabilitation and in mental health, there's no end date to this recovery, right? Recovery is more of a journey that somebody with a mental health condition is going on in order to get back to whatever desired state they want to be in, right? And it might not look exactly the same as it did before they were diagnosed with their mental health condition, but it could look as close as it can. Okay, so recovery is very much individualized and very specific to the person. In addition to quality of life, right? Quality of life is really looking at helping individuals to achieve a quality of life in the same way and similar to any other person. Okay. Everybody has the ability to determine what type of quality of life that they have, or what kind of quality of life they want for them, and what makes up a person's quality of life. One example that I've used in the past, and this also kind of goes into community integration, is some people are really social. Some people very much value outside social relationships. And maybe some of you out there, right? Does anybody have like a really good friend group that maybe they see often, that they go out with and spend time with? Does anybody out there have that for themselves? Because I'm going to be honest with all of you. See, I'm like you, Ty. I just have my family, right? That is not having a large social friend group, where it looks like, I'm going to say Non again, and Christine. That's something that it sounds like is something that impacts your quality of life in a positive way. But that's not something that impacts my quality of life in a positive way. I don't necessarily need that to have a good quality of life. I have a great quality of life without having to have a very large social group, right? So again, quality of life is something that is very specific and individualized. And yeah, right, family can very much be just as important as social groups, but some people don't have family. I have a coworker who has lost both of their parents, right? So their quality of life is, in terms of socialization, is very much focused on those social relationships that they have, as well as the relationship that they have with themselves, right? Quality of life also looks at things like the person's environment and their living situation and their living condition and the type of things that they have access to, right? So also acknowledging some of those resources, right? Does the person have adequate access to certain resources that are going to help them to improve their quality of life? What is their healthcare like? What are their medical providers or psychiatric providers like, right? All of that can also fall under that umbrella of quality of life. And then finally, we have community integration. And community integration can very much be looked at in one sense of somebody living in the community, right? But community integration is actually much, much more than that in the lens of psych rehab, right? So community integration is being involved and a part of your community in whatever way that means to the person, right? So community integration is really looking at, does the person know their neighbors? Do they want to know their neighbors? Does the person want to utilize different community resources, like maybe be a part of the library, or join the community center and see what's happening at a community center, or if the person is of a certain age, going to like a senior center, right? Absolutely, it can very much be about making connections, but again, to the extent that the person wants. And the other thing I want to highlight about all of these goals of psych rehab is that we want to emphasize that choice and what the person wants. But if the person doesn't want something, we also want to explore why, right? So if we go back to community integration and we look at this idea of making connections, like Nat said, for me personally, I'm satisfied right now in my life with just having my family and a few close friends, right? There's nothing else that's impacting that for me. However, other people might feel similarly to me in terms of they don't want to maybe have as many social connections, maybe because they're afraid, or maybe because they don't think they deserve to have those connections. Maybe they feel like nobody will like them or nobody will understand them, right? And there's a very big difference between, I just don't kind of want that in my life, versus I don't want that because I don't think anybody will like me, or I don't think I can have that type of thing, right? So in looking at these different goals of psych rehab, you also want to consider what you can do as a practitioner to help the person to kind of flesh out, is that something that they actually don't want? Or are there reasons that could potentially be changed behind that's influencing them not wanting that, right? Even looking at something like recovery. Maybe for somebody, recovery, they want it to be about maybe getting a job, or they want it to be about maybe reuniting with their children, or they want it to be about maybe owning their own property, but they just don't think that that's something that they can achieve or that they can have, right? So really being able to flesh that out. Do you have anybody that you're working with where you've kind of had that happen, where they're like, no, I don't want that, and then after maybe getting to know them better or talking with them a little bit more, you've figured out that it's maybe some of the thoughts that they have about themselves that are preventing them from trying to achieve a specific goal? Well, I know that I can give you all an example of how something similar like that happened to me when I was working with an individual in the past. Um, they had a very challenging relationship with their child. And they were hospitalized a lot, I want to say, in their child's like teenage years and adolescence. And they very much desired to, and this is something that I would say is more impactful of their quality of life. They very much desired to try to get to know their child again, who is now an adult or a young adult, and really trying to make a connection with that person, with their child. And but it had never come up, and it was never something that they kind of disclosed, but I was doing the assessment with them, and I don't quite remember what specifically they said, um, because they were very adamant, like, we would ask about family connections and like, "Hey, do you ever wanna reach out to your family?" "No, I don't want to." And they said something that made me ask, like, "Well, what about if, nothing had ever happened between, you and your child, if some of the negative experiences that, you had with her, if they had never happened, do you wish you would still have contact with your daughter?" And he said, "Yes, absolutely." I said, "Oh, so, tell me a little bit more about what's, going on then. What's stopping you now? Is it some of these experiences?" And that led us down into this conversation of the fact that, when they were actively experiencing symptoms, um, they had their relationship was very challenging. It was hard for them to connect with their child. Their child was a teenager. They didn't really want to spend time with them. And it was just a lot of, I think, miscommunication, but it was those experiences that made my client think, well, they don't want anything to do with me. They don't want to get to know me. And we had a lot of conversations and then kind of started working with them to build their confidence around starting this relationship with their child. And eventually they reached out, and their child was very open to having a relationship with them. Right. So we were able to kind of differentiate between, this was something they actually wanted to work on. They just didn't believe that they could, or that there was a chance that their child would reciprocate how they were feeling. I also want to kind of tie it back to this idea of hope streams and aspirations regarding recovery. Because a huge component of recovery is this hope for the future, right? It's this idea that the person may be experiencing some challenges now, or maybe in the past they experienced these challenges. But at the end of the day, in the future, there's hope. There's hope that they can achieve their hopes, dreams, and aspirations, right? There's hope that they can work toward their goals and get to a point in their life where they're feeling happy and they're feeling satisfied with their life. Um, and this can very much play an integral part in supporting their recovery. Because and you let me know if this has been your experience with the individuals you're working with. I've worked with a lot of individuals who, at one time or another, very much lost hope, especially when they were in the state psychiatric hospital. It was a very traumatic experience for a lot of the individuals I worked with, and they had a lot of trouble living there. So, when they were in the hospital, it was very hard for them to even think about what their future might look like. And upon getting out of the hospital, they were still kind of in that point of like, I don't know, I can't think about the future. I can only think about the next 6 months. I don't know what I want for my future. But having that hope and really thinking about what the person might want in the future, that's going to be a motivational factor for them, right? And this also includes this idea of dreams and aspirations, right? What does the person really desire? What do they envision their life looking like, right? And this all falls under that umbrella of recovery. So this is where I really want to get some feedback from all of you. So we're at this point where we're meeting with an individual, right? We're sitting down and we're meeting with them, and we're thinking about what they want to work on for their goals, right? So I want to ask, how do the goals of psych rehab inform a consumer's overall rehabilitation goal? What is that connection? What is that influence? And feel free to ask me. I can unmute you if you'd rather share through unmuting. But what do you all think about how the goals of psych rehab inform a consumer's overall rehab goal? So Heather, you said if there's a significant mismatch, the client may be enrolled in the wrong services program. Can you clarify that a little bit? I'm not 100% clear on what you mean. A mismatch in what? Potentially. Can you give me a specific example though on how the goals the client has might not be might be mismatched with psych rehab? Because in my experience, a lot of the goals that I'm thinking of, at least for the individual I was working with, they kind of all fell under those three umbrellas in terms of like either toward recovery, quality of life, or community integration. Um, so yeah, right. So for somebody, if we think of recovery, right, that could be stabilization for somebody, right? Or it could be quality of life, right? For somebody to have what they see as good and positive quality of life, that could be them being stabilized, and maybe not having any hospitalizations, right? That could very much be an overall rehabilitation goal, right? Remaining in the community and not being hospitalized or having minimal hospitalizations over the next 2 years. That could very well be an overall rehabilitation goal. The next thing I want to ask, um, is when you're sitting and you're having some of these conversations with people, and you're meeting with them, what questions can you ask the individuals that you're working with to help them identify some of these overall rehabilitation goals? Now, generally speaking, right, if we go back to recovery, community integration, and quality of life, you could very well just simply ask, um, tell me about what recovery means to you, or tell me what a good quality of life means to you, or tell me about what community integration might mean to you, right? And having that conversation with them could then potentially lead to them being able to identify a goal. What other questions might you ask somebody to help around the goals of psych rehab to help them identify an overall rehabilitation goal? So, what else could you ask about quality of life, recovery, or community integration? That's a really great question, Nat. The question would be, how do you, if we were speaking directly to the consumer, how do you see yourself participating in your recovery? And or what steps would you take to identify, um, what steps can you identify and then take? Those are really, really great examples of questions. And I think those questions would lead to a lot of really good information, right? So, in terms of how the person sees themselves participating in their recovery, right? Do they have active participation? Do they feel capable of actively participating? If they don't feel able to actively participate, why? Is there a goal that could come from that aspect of it? Um, Again, what steps, right? Those steps that the person takes, or the person mentions, I should say, those could all potentially be goals that they could work on, in that shorter time period in order to achieve their recovery, right? Because maybe that's their overall rehab goal, to work toward, um, their own recovery. What other types of questions might you ask consumers to help them to identify their overall rehab goals around community integration and, quality of life and, recovery? So, Stephanie, you said, I have asked what is a trigger and how to avoid those. Um, Often boredom comes up, and we work toward creating small goals to avoid boredom and therefore are addressing triggers and more often come across other small goals to achieve the larger picture. Absolutely, right? Because at the end of the day, those smaller goals are leading towards something. And I think it can be hard for people initially to kind of conceptualize that because maybe they don't necessarily know where it's going. Like, especially if you think about somebody who, has maybe only been housed, right? They've been unhoused for quite some time and they've only been housed for maybe 6 months. They might not have a good grasp of where they're going and what that larger goal is and what the larger picture is. Um, but after a little bit of time and stability, I definitely think it's easier to figure that out. Um, and I can see how boredom can definitely be something that comes up. That was something that was very much echoed in the individuals that I was working with. But it sounds like for you, asking about what some of their triggers are is something that really opens up the conversation and probably builds a lot of engagement and rapport and leads to, like you said, some of those smaller goals. And then that kind of opens it up to larger goals. So I really like that. I think that's a really great question. Cheryl, you said, how would recovery benefit them and how would it help your situation or improve your life? I think having a conversation around the benefits of recovery, I think that's a really great question to ask and also a really good conversation to have. Because I think it can also open up about helping and encouraging the person to really think about what recovery actually means to them. Because I think a lot of people don't know what recovery necessarily means to them off the bat, right? It's something you do have to think about a little bit. And then how would it help your situation or improve your life, right? That's where the goal can come from, right? So when you're asking how it would help the situation or improve your life, and they say, oh, well, it would allow me to have X, Y, and Z, then that's their goal. Their goal is whatever is coming from that. So that's a really, really great question as well, Cheryl. Thank you. Yolanda, you said, where do you see yourself and what step would you want to take in a time frame? A small goal can be as little as by day. Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%, right? I don't know about you all, but I definitely set small goals for myself every day. And yeah, I like the question of where do you see yourself? Because I think that can bring a lot of really good visuals for somebody, especially thinking about some of the people that you're working with. A lot of people respond really well to that almost tangential kind of approach of like, well, what do you see? Like, what do you visualize? So I really like that question because sometimes a picture of something, like, well, I see myself happy, and then it can kind of lead to like, oh, well, what are you doing? What is actually making you happy? That can help to kind of narrow down and hone in on a specific goal. And then the steps, right? The steps are going to then be those smaller goals that you're going to take and develop to achieve that goal. So I love that. And then Earl, thank you, Earl. Earl said, what would your ideal neighborhood look like? Right. And I think that's a really great question, especially when thinking of housing, because what kind of environment do they want to live in? Right. And that's definitely something to work toward. And I like that as an idea of an overall rehab goal, right? Because I think right now we're in a housing crisis, right? I definitely know that you are in a housing crisis in Washington, very similar to how we're in a housing crisis here in New Jersey, right? So right now, the person might be living in an apartment, and it might not be where they see themselves in the future, right? But that's something to work toward, right? So what are they learning about their environment, and what does that ideal neighborhood actually look like toward them, or for them, I should say, and how can they get there, right? What valued life roles are important to you and why, right? So what roles do you see yourself being in? So valued life roles are those roles that we encompass as people that are like motivating factors, right? So and motivating factors toward our goal. So valued life role, it could be mother, could be father, it could be daughter, it could be sibling, it could be a worker, it could be a contributing member of society. But that's that role that we identify with that is something that's going to help motivate us, right? So what are those valued life roles? What are our valued life roles, and why? Why are they important to us? So I really like that, right? Because if the valued life role is mother, then maybe the goal is about improving improving their relationship with their children, or really looking at what steps they can take in order to be what they define as a good mother. And then Earl has another question of what kind of supports would you need to live successfully in the community? Right? So what knowledge, what skills, and maybe what resources does the person need to live successfully in the community? And what does living successfully in the community actually look like to that person? Right? So is it about maybe volunteering? Is it about maybe getting into politics? Is it about being involved in the different community resources, again, like a library or a community center, right? So what is that? What does living successful in the community actually look like, and what kind of supports are needed to get there? And again, that leads to some goals, that leads to some things that you can help and support the person with. And absolutely, Net, right? So you might also ask what has worked well in the past and what has not, right? So, and I think that's a really great follow-up question for any of the questions that we just talked about, and that you also kindly put in the chat box, right? So when you are focusing on this goal, right, what has worked well for you and what hasn't? I think that's a fantastic follow-up question. And absolutely, Yolanda, right? Giving that option of choices. And again, these questions are, it's not a hard and fast rule to live by, but it can be a way to open that dialogue and open that conversation and give the person a safe place to really talk about some of these topics. Because again, if we go back to this idea of hope, a lot of the experiences that, and I say this because I know this is something that the individuals I was working with voiced to me, right? A lot of the individuals I worked with went through very challenging experiences that decreased their hope. So, being able to create an open and safe space for them to be vulnerable and kind of talk about their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations, and then helping them to feel comfortable and confident enough to turn that into a goal, that's a really amazing process. And giving them that choice and supporting them in working toward those goals, that's part of what we do, right? That's one of the reasons why we do what we do. Does anybody have any other questions or comments or anything that they'd like to add? All right. Well, I would just like to thank everybody. That's all I have for today. So first and foremost, I want to thank you all for engaging in the conversation today. I think you guys came up with a lot of really, really good questions. And I hope that this kind of gave you something more to think about when you're working with individuals to develop some of their short-term goals, and helping to support them and really thinking about some of those longer term goals and those overall rehabilitation goals. So thank you again very much. Um, we definitely appreciate your time, attention, and participation. And again, I just want to mention that today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. I do want to remind you that the slides and a link to the recording of the session, as well as any resources, are going to be available in the follow-up email. I know that in the follow-up email, Washington usually sends out some of their future training opportunities. So please be on the lookout for those. And then don't forget to check out the Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all things foundational community supports, as well as upcoming training events. And then if you would like more information on becoming an FCS provider, that's the phone number for AmeriGroup. So I'm going to stop recording.